All right. Hello, all, and welcome to another Pollak Library Noontime Talk. I'm Mike DeMars, Associate Dean for Public Services, sitting in for Dean Hanson this afternoon. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Carrie Lane, whose talk delves into the world of professional organizers, exploring their history, real-life practices, and the gendered, emotional, and economic complexities of organizing as it relates to work, consumption, and home life. Dr. Lane is an anthropologist in the American Studies Department who studies the changing nature of work. She's especially interested in the ways Americans go about trying to simplify and improve their lives in the face of overwork and overwhelm. Her latest book is More Than Pretty Boxes: How the Rise of Professional Organizing Shows Us the Way We Work Isn't Working. Dr. Lane, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for having me today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I know your time is valuable, and I know this day is a stressful one. And so it means a lot to me that you took the time to attend this virtual lecture. And I'm going to try to keep it light, and I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for questions because I'm excited to hear what you're interested in. So, one day, many years ago, more than a decade ago, in fact, which tells you how long I worked on this project before it became a book. In an effort to make more space in my kitchen cabinet, I pulled out a few of my least favorite mugs to donate to Goodwill. And these are not the actual mugs I donated, but I had to throw this image in because in the resulting book, I sandwich between the chapters what I call organizing stories that are little vignettes about the organizing jobs that I did as an unpaid assistant to actual professional organizers. And a wonderful artist, Charlotte Corden, I commissioned her to do line drawings for each of those sort of vignettes that sandwich between the chapters. And this is one of them. So I got to use it for this as well. So one day, there I am in my kitchen, and I'm going through my mugs, and I decide to take out a few of them that I'm not really into to create a little more space, and I'm going to donate them somewhere. And as I look at that shelf that has 3 or 4 fewer mugs than it used to, I could feel my stress level lowering. And I felt really proud of myself in that moment, right? That I had really done something. Over mugs, people, I felt proud of myself about having a few fewer mugs, right? Getting rid of a few mugs and sending them out into the universe for other people to drink their tea out of them. As a cultural anthropologist, that's when you know something is going on, culturally speaking. When a small task like decluttering carries with it such hefty symbolic and emotional weight. Fewer mugs equals a better person with a happier life. And when I feel that kind of thinking going on, I have to call bullshit because that's what I do as a cultural critic. And so I did what academics do. I started researching. And the more I read and heard and watched, the more it became clear that something really interesting was going on a cultural level around Americans' obsession with organizing and decluttering. Real Simple Magazine, The Container Store, TV shows like Hoarders, Clean Sweep, Extreme Clutter, and Master the Mess. Then came Marie Kondo's best-selling book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, and we were sparking joy all over the place, right? So at first, I wanted to write a cultural history of organizing and the entire containo-industrial complex. That's somebody else's term, but I wish I had invented it. Then, as part of that larger project, that larger cultural history, I decided to interview a few professional organizers who declutter for a living. And then once I started interviewing them, I never stopped. And this is the resulting book. This is the book that I ended up writing, which actually focuses entirely on professional organizers, why they do this work, what the work actually involves, and where this industry came from in the first place. So it's that last piece, where the industry came from and how it grew. That's what I'm going to dig into today in this talk. But first, let me back up a little bit. So the larger study of which this talk is a part, it's an interdisciplinary project, which makes sense because I am trained as an anthropologist, but I then got my PhD in American Studies. So I combine anthropology with contemporary history and a little analysis of pop culture thrown in. So for this particular project, I interviewed more than 50 professional organizers, mostly in Los Angeles and Orange County, but some in cities and towns around the country. I attended organizing lectures and workshops, as well as meetings of professional association events and conferences for professional organizers. And I worked alongside organizers as an unpaid assistant for more than 100 hours. Now, that is not really the focus of this talk, what organizing sessions actually look like on the ground, but I will just tell you as a sort of teaser for what's in the book, right? One of the most important things I learned is that being a good organizer has nothing to do with the stuff. Doesn't have anything to do with how you can file or if you know the best shelving units to order, right? It's about offering clients empathy, connection, and a lack of judgment. It's about disabusing people, especially women, who are responsible for most of the homes and workspaces and how they're organized and whether or not they're cluttered, right? It's about disabusing people of harmful and unrealistic expectations of themselves and of their spaces, right? So it's not like what you may have seen on TV if you're a person who watches a lot of organizing shows. But again, that's not what this talk is about, so you're gonna have to read the book for that. So the next part of what I did is I analyzed representations of professional organizing in pop culture, from reality TV to organizing books, magazines, blogs, and websites. I watched episodes of sitcoms that involved decluttering, like Modern Family or The Big Bang Theory. And I even watched a really, truly terrible Hallmark Christmas movie where a professional organizer and her client fall in love over clutter. As well, and this is the part that we're talking about mostly today, with the help of a team of wonderful American Studies graduate students, I've researched the history of professional organizing, combing through historical newspapers and archives and databases for the very first mentions of organizing and organizers in American history. So today, I'm going to draw mostly from those interviews with organizers, especially those who helped pioneer this field, and also from that historical research. So clutter is not new, nor are efforts to get rid of it. In the 15th century, the word clutter was used as a verb to mean collect in heaps or form clots. The word comes from the Middle English word clotterin, which means to clot. I'd just like to pause and say, clotterin? That just sounds gross. So clutter isn't new, is my point, nor is concern about it. What also isn't new is the idea that managing clutter is women's work. In the Victorian era, clutter was in. Victorian design ideals privileged coziness over simplicity. And it was middle-class women's jobs and the working class and lower income women that they employed. It was their jobs to personalize homes with handiwork and bric-a-brac to foster creative expression, moral growth, and notions of gentility. Now, during the progressive era, a new emphasis on efficiency and rationality prompted a shift away from comfy clutter towards simpler, more functional designs. It also saw the rise of the feminist-led domestic engineering movement. Famed suffragist Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for example, wrote in 1898 that the female housekeeper, quote, has crowded her limited habitat with unlimited things, and the labor of her life is to wait upon these things and to keep them clean. So whether Victorian or progressive, whether clutter was in fashion or out of fashion, women were the ones who were expected to do the work of aligning domestic spaces with the aesthetic and cultural ideals of the moment. And women's responsibility for wrangling clutter didn't just belong in the home. As women moved into secretarial work in the early 20th century, office wives, as early secretaries were often called, carried aspects of domesticity into previously all-male workplaces. So one 1928 LA Times article titled "Feminine Hands Have Taken Dirt and Clutter Out of Offices" attributed the birth of the modern filing system to women's move from housekeeping jobs into office work. Now, moving on from there, real quick, the rise of modernist architecture and design between the two world wars continued this trend towards simpler, clutter-free spaces. Then after World War II, Americans were told soldiers returning from war would be, quote, ill at ease in rooms that are filled with too much furniture and knickknacks. And so maintaining a clutter-free home became yet another thing wives were expected to do for returning veterans. In addition to surrendering their war jobs, submerging their own sexual desires, and avoiding, and I'm actually quoting a news article here from the post-war period, avoiding unfeminine characteristics such as a preference for colorless nails, slacks, and economic independence. So from the mid-century on, decluttering and organizing tips regularly appeared in women's magazines. In 1962, a tricky but scientific quiz helped women determine exactly how poor a housekeeper they really are. Those who scored low on the quiz were offered a list of 5 tips for bad housekeepers, including get help, beg, borrow, steal, but hire some household assistants, enlist the rest of the family, sacrifice luxuries to pay for professional cleaning or laundering, get a part-time job to finance it if you need. So this idea, the idea that you might actually pay someone else to help keep you organized and clutter-free, was not new. There have always been people who organized other people's things for pay. Butlers, maids, housekeepers, secretaries, personal assistants, efficiency experts, architects, interior designers, among others, not to mention the unpaid work of homemakers. But in each of those cases, decluttering and organizing were components of a job, not the job itself. It was only in the 1970s that the organizing and winnowing of personal belongings began to emerge as an occupational category of its own, one that from the very start was populated primarily by women. So in 1975, New York Magazine published a special home furnishings issue titled Get Organized, Neatness Counts. And I probably don't have to point out this to you, but that's a really creepy image of all of these lockers and there's stuff inside, and then you have a woman's body that's bifurcated between these locker doors. It's disturbing on all sorts of levels, but we'll move on to what was actually inside the article about getting organized. So the issue profiled New York's, quote, most organized people. It recommended storage solutions in the form of high-end designer bookshelves and wall units, and it featured advice from time and motion specialists. The article was titled, "The Second Most Satisfying Thing in the World, Getting Organized." It didn't say what the first most satisfying thing was, but we can probably guess. Now, they consulted, quote, 3 sophisticated specialists on how to deal with everyday, low-grade environmental disarray. The piece included time management expert Alan Lakin, environmental systems designer Robert Probst, who you might know as the inventor of the cubicle, and, quote, systems analyst Stephanie Winston. Now, Lakin and Probst worked within established fields of time and motion studies and industrial design. Respectively, both of these were fields with roots in scientific management from the Progressive Era. Winston's occupation is a little less clear in this article. A Barnard graduate and former freelance book editor, Winston clarified that she was neither a decorator nor a neatness expert, but someone who helps people sort their belongings, decide what to keep or discard, and develop systems to get, quote, the specifics of their life in order. Her company was called The Organizing Principle, and she founded it 2 years earlier. And it was described as part of, quote, a new profession that may do for the individual what systems analysts have been doing for industry for years. But in this article, at least, that new profession went unnamed. Within 3 years, that had changed. A 1978 front page article in the Washington Post titled "Sinking Under the Clutter, the Organizer Can Get You Out of It," introduced Winston as a, quote, professional organizer who had pioneered a new service. By 1978, the article reported, Winston was charging $135 a day for individuals and $225 a day for corporate clients. Actually, interestingly, organizers now charge those rates about by the hour in most cases, or many cases, I should say. So although the Post article refers to Winston as the organizer, she wasn't the only one. By the late 1970s, there were at least a dozen other professional organizers working in New York and other major cities. So Barbara Hemphill, for instance, started her organizing business in 1978. The year before, Hemphill and her husband had returned to the United States after living for 5 years in India, where they'd adopted 3 orphaned children. Her husband's nonprofit salary wasn't enough to support their expanded family, Hemphill told me in an interview 30 years after she'd started her business. She was still working in the field. So she needed to find a way to bring in money without taking a full-time job. She'd been a teacher before, but hadn't liked the rigid working hours, especially now that she had kids. She'd heard people talk about their troubles with disorganization, quote, about how they hadn't eaten off the dining room table in months because it was piled full of papers, or they couldn't file their income taxes because they couldn't find their receipts. Now, organization had always been one of her strengths. So, she told me, I took $7 out of the grocery money to pay for a newspaper ad, which is a big deal because I used to walk 20 blocks because I didn't have 50 cents for the bus. The ad read, disorganized, question mark? I organize closets, files, kitchens, you name it, call Barbara Hemphill. And people did call. The first 3 calls were from men who were trying to pick her up. The fourth call was from a newly widowed woman whose husband, an attorney, had died and left behind 2 offices full of disorganized paperwork, one at home and one at his workplace. His wife had no idea what to do. Hemphill said, "She didn't know that she was my first client, and I didn't tell her, and that was kind of how I started." Hemphill hadn't really intended to start a business, but it seemed that now she had one. So in 1979, she visited the Washington, D.C. Small Business Administration and asked for help putting together a business plan for her new organizing business. The all-male group, she told me, just laughed me out of the room. "No way, lady," they told her. "That's not a business." They told her she was crazy and that no one would pay to have someone organize their closets and kitchens. She wasn't the only one who got pushback. Convincing people to pay for services that had previously been provided for free by usually female family members or subsumed within low-status jobs such as housekeeping or secretarial work wasn't easy, especially for organizers who plan to work primarily in home spaces. Now I'm going to show you these ladies and I'm going to tell you more about them as we go, but I will start out by saying that the same year that Hemphill was laughed out of the Small Business Association, across the country, Beverly Hills homemaker Maxine Ordesky, and you can see Maxine here on the left in this photo. I don't know if your left is my left looking at this, but in the brown outfit, right? That's Maxine. So Maxine had been looking for something to do while her young sons were in school most of the day. She lived in Beverly Hills and the family didn't need money. Her husband's income supported them amply. But she told me when I interviewed her, I was bored. She was, in her words, not the type to spend her days lunching and shopping in Beverly Hills. She'd worked in offices before she got married, but she didn't want to go back. She needed a flexible job she could work around her kids' school schedules. One morning, her husband was watching the Today Show and he saw Stephanie Winston being interviewed on the show. And he yelled to Maxine, come in here, watch this. There's a woman on here doing something you could do. So Maxine watched the segment with him and she thought, I can do that. And Maxine is actually well into her 80s and still doing that. She still organizes for a living, especially closets. So Maxine came up with a name, the Creative Organizer. And in 1975, she ran her first ad in the back of Los Angeles Magazine. I never in a million years thought the phone would ring, she said, and it did immediately. So I was off and running. She started out charging $15 an hour. One day, a potential client called and he was talking to me about coming in and organizing his office. And we had this whole long conversation, she said. At the end of the call, he asked how much she charged and she told him $15 an hour and he was silent. She was worried he thought it was too high. And she asked, is there a problem? And he said, well, yes, actually there is. If that's all you're charging, you don't do what I think you do. Relating the story, she paused to ask me, shoulders raised, what do you say to that? She couldn't salvage the call. She lost that client, but she immediately raised her rates. Within a few years, Ordesky met another LA organizer, Stephanie Culp. Tired of the secretarial and waitressing jobs she'd been working, in 1979, Culp decided to start her own business. At that time, she told me, quote, women just didn't start their own businesses. Women were not entrepreneurs. You had Mary Kay selling cosmetics, or you had Tupperware housewives selling Tupperware. That was it in terms of entrepreneurial stuff for women. I don't think today's young women can even imagine how it was back then. But Culp was determined to make it work. And Culp is wearing the red cardigan with a flower on it and the brown and the gray skirt in this photo. Billing herself as the grinning idiot, Culp ran a classified ad offering all-purpose errand services in a local Santa Monica newspaper. The ad read, have your idiot work done by pros. Nothing is too moronic or mundane. Call the grinning idiot. The ad worked. She walked dogs, cleaned up after parties, whatever walked in the door, she recalled during our interview. She's still a working organizer as well. Eventually, her work started to involve more and more organizing, and she transformed from grinning idiot into professional organizer. Although she quickly found enough work to support herself through organizing, when she told her family what she was doing, they asked, why don't you get a real job? Back then, she explained to me, organizers were perceived as glorified housekeepers. It didn't matter how you explained it to them, she remembered. They still equated it with hiring a housekeeper or a cleaning crew. So despite the many differences between them, married or single, mothers or child-free, working for the money or just because they wanted to, organizers kept encountering resistance to the idea that organizing is real work. Like homemaking and housekeeping, organizing is labor performed primarily by women, often in the home, that involves providing services to other people. This trifecta of characteristics is not an auspicious one for a budding profession. These overlapping categories, women's work, domestic work, care work, service work, they all tend to receive lower pay and status than other forms of work performed by other kinds of people. So I should note here, there are male professional organizers. There aren't many of them. I typically hear that 98% of organizers are women, and I actually suspect that is a low estimate. However, you know, when I met one guy at a national organizing conference in Baltimore, he made the joke, you know, there's never a line for the men's room at an APO conference. So there are some, but there are not many of them. Anyway, so early organizers needed potential clients to understand what it was they did for a living, but they wanted their work to be understood in a particular way, one that conferred upon this new profession a legitimacy that would translate into higher pay and more respect. So a few of them, Stephanie Winston is one of them, argued that all domestic work, paid or unpaid, deserves more respect, right? She said, I would like to see a CEO come and run a household for 1 week and tell me that this isn't real challenging work that requires a specific skill set, right? However, most organizers actually took the opposite tack, leaving the gender and class stigmas around housewifery and domestic work firmly in place. They denied any similarities between those jobs and their own. Instead, they emphasized parallels between organizing and higher status professions. As early as 1979, one organizer described herself as a physician for those who suffer from chronic disorganization. In 1982, another framed herself as a physician for messy people and a doctor for the disorganized. As therapy and therapeutic language became increasingly common, other organizers began to refer to themselves as clutter therapists or the paper therapist. As established professions long dominated by upper-class men, medicine and psychology carried with them a gravitas and legitimacy that homemaking and housekeeping lacked. Now, another way that organizers laid claim to professional status was by calling themselves professional organizers as opposed to just organizers. I had an absurdly who's on first type conversation with another anthropologist where she said, no, you're talking about personal organizers. And I said, no, they're professional organizers. And she said, wait, but they organize homes. And I said, yeah, they're professional organizers who work in personal spaces, right? So all organizers who organize other people for money see themselves as professional organizers. The adjective professional in this case describes the person doing the organizing. They're professionals, not amateurs, not the kind of organizing they're doing. So it does seem like overkill to include professional in a profession's title. Doctors don't go around referring to themselves as professional doctors, nor do we read about professional lawyers or professional professors for that matter. Practitioners in those fields don't need to go to such lengths to signal their status. Their discipline's long and distinguished histories and specialized credentials already do that for them. Early organizers had none of those things. Each woman was waging her own small, independent battle to be taken seriously by the people around her. In order for that to change, a critical mass of organizers were going to have to actually meet one another. And in 1983, that's exactly what happened. So as I mentioned, a few organizers found each other early on, thanks to news media or happy accidents. Organizer Beverly Clower, she's the one at the center of this photo. I actually just saw her a few months ago. She is in her 80s and now retired, but she likes to attend NAPO conferences still because she says everybody constantly compliments her and gives her pets for being one of the founders. So she goes every time that she can. So she started her organizing business in 1982. Beverly actually started working in the US South at age 16 as a secretary. And she worked as a secretary in small businesses and in banks for many years. And then eventually she started working. She did a secretary, like a study abroad program for secretaries, and started doing secretarial work in London. She liked living in Europe. So she spent more than a decade working for different businesses in different Western European countries. So she always tried to leave an office in better shape than she found it, regardless of what specific tasks they hired her for. And one day, a fellow secretary told her, Beverly, you're very organized. And Beverly told me that the compliment took her by surprise because I'd never thought of that word pertaining to me or anyone else, being organized or otherwise. So when she eventually returned back to the States, Beverly took a few more secretarial positions, and then one of the companies she was working for closed down. She decided it was time to see other cities, so she decided she was going to go to 5 different cities and see which one she liked. She went to Los Angeles first, and she never left. That was it. She's still here. So she decided she'd had enough of working for somebody else full time. She wanted to start her own business as a freelance office worker, is what she called it. And she named her company Office Overhaul. She told me, I've always been more comfortable in the office than in the kitchen. And I thought I was the world's first and only office organizer or organizer of any kind. But less than a year later, a new woman joined Beverly's singing group. During the break, the two of them began chatting. And Beverly told me, she said what she did, and I said what I did. And we just looked at each other in shock that we were doing the same thing. And we both thought, nobody else does what I do. Beverly laughed when she looked back at this, and she said, we didn't know whether to hug or slap each other. I mean, it was a letdown and a big, nice surprise, too. So around the same time, San Diego organizer Karen Shortridge was profiled on the front page of the LA Times and began to receive an avalanche of calls from potential clients, but also from other people who were looking to start their own organizing businesses. So she and another organizer she'd met, who it turns out, and I didn't know this until interviews conducted years apart, turns out it was the one who was in Beverly Clower's singing group. Her name is Susan Rich. So the two of them met, and they kind of circled each other warily because they didn't like the idea of competing for the same clients. But eventually, Karen and Susan sat down and decided they wanted to bring together all the people who were working in this new field or hoping to work in this new field. So in 1983, when a local paper wrote an article about her, Karen Shortridge added a little notice at the end, inviting others interested in organizing to a meeting later that week at Rich's home. So within a year, 10 to 12 organizers, all based in Southern California, mostly white women in their 30 to 50s, were meeting monthly at one another's homes. They got to know one another and they talked about their work. It was exciting, attendees recalled, to connect with others who were not only organized like themselves, but hoping to create a business out of that skill. Working with people who are disorganized can be stressful, even overwhelming at times, as can running one's own business. Coming together allowed organizers to sympathize with and support one another, to exchange practical strategies and advice, and to build a new community around this nascent profession. Interestingly, organizers today still use language that this first group coined, referring to themselves as the most collaborative competitors that you'll ever see. So for some attendees, like NAPO co-founder Anne Gambrell, that's Anne in the pink jacket at the end with the short gray hair. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago, but I did have a chance to interview 4 of the 5 founders as part of this research project. The other founder, Jeannie Shore, in the yellow jacket, actually suffered some pretty serious health issues and left the profession many decades ago and wasn't able to be contacted. So, but the other 4, I was able to speak with all of them, and I'm still in touch with 3 of the 5, although unfortunately, like I said, Anne passed away a few years ago. So Anne Gambrell, who I know you're not supposed to not have favorites, but of the founders, Anne's my favorite. Maybe it's a tie, Beverly and Anne, but don't push me to choose. Anyway, so Anne, I interviewed Anne at her clean, cozy Los Angeles home many years ago, and she greeted me outside the door and said, "Congratulations, you just passed Organizing 101. You're on time." Right? Anne was born just outside Chicago in the 1940s, and she said her job options were limited growing up. The only professions at that time for women, she told me, teaching, nursing, and hairdressing. She chose nursing, and she spent 23 years as a psychiatric nurse. In 1964, she moved to Torrance with her husband and young children, and she started nursing at a local hospital. After 20 years at that hospital, she was at a women's group she had joined, and they had a guest speaker on organizing. And the whole time she was talking, Anne recalled to me, I was improving on her talk in my head. I was not a speaker, but I was thinking, oh, I would have said this. I would have given this example or told this story, which would have made that point. And that night on the drive home, Anne Gambrell decided to become an organizer. She began teaching organizing classes at a local adult school to promote her business. At a networking event, a woman told Gambrell about a group of local organizers who'd been meeting. Gambrell found their number, called, got the address, and drove up to LA for the meeting. She said she was intimidated by how much more experienced they seemed to be. I was such a novice, she told me. I had no idea what they were talking about, but I knew that it was something I wanted to do. So when she got home that night from that first meeting, Gambrell told her husband, she called her husband into the bedroom and he asked how the meeting went. And she said, I don't know where these women are going, but I'm going with them. And for her, that was it. So in some respects, again, these organizers were a varied group. Some had working spouses, others were single and self-supporting, some had kids, some didn't. Some were wealthy, others barely scraping by. Some worked exclusively in offices, some worked exclusively in private homes. But in other respects, they had a lot in common. You can see all were white women. Most of them were 30 or older. All had completed high school. Most had some additional schooling, whether college or secretarial or nursing school. All had worked in other jobs before becoming organizers, including those who'd stopped working when they had kids. And they all made a conscious decision not to stay in or return to their previous occupations. Some needed a job they could integrate with parenting responsibilities. Others craved work that was more fun, more varied, or more meaningful than what they'd been doing before. And interestingly, even now, right, we're heading on 50 years later, when women have far more professional options available to them, many of the organizers I speak with today who have just joined the field are drawn to organizing for the exact same reasons, namely because they say standard employment has failed to offer them the flexibility, the meaning, and the self-determination that they want and need in their work. So this little group of organizers grew, and they morphed. They lost some members, they gained some more. For whatever reason, Karen Shortridge really pissed everybody off because none of the founders like to even mention her name. She's like Voldemort in this early organizing circle. But regardless, the group continued to meet. And in 1984, about a dozen organizers officially founded the Association of Professional Organizers, APO. And they soon renamed it NAPO, the National Association of Professional Organizers. And in 1985, 1 year later, the group elected its first slate of officers. And that's who you see here. Beverly Clower, Stephanie Culp, Anne Gambrell, Maxine Rodesky, and former accountant Jeannie Short. And all of these are now referred to as NAPO's founders. So in its earliest years, NAPO focused on generating awareness of professional organizing as a whole. As they saw it, broader exposure for the field would be a rising tide that lifted all of their boats. After all, if a potential client didn't know that organizing even existed, it didn't really matter which of these organizers they were going to choose to hire. There was also still a long way to go before people stopped equating organizers with house cleaners or confusing them with labor organizers. That, interestingly, is what happened to me the first time. So whenever I mentioned I was studying professional organizers, people thought, especially anthropologists, they all thought I meant labor organizers. But with time, I've noticed that has happened less and less often. I think because professional organizing is just more and more omnipresent in our sort of cultural ether. So each of these founders played to their own strengths. Those who enjoyed public speaking gave talks and led meetings. The writers among them published books and articles about organizing, careful to always include mentions of NAPO. Those with accounting and business experience handled the finances, set up the bylaws, and secured 501c3 status as a nonprofit. The more outgoing interacted with event attendees and new members across the country. And the most tenacious waged a 3-year, eventually successful battle with the California Yellow Pages to include an entry for professional organizers in the telephone directory. They're actually still working to have professional organizer included as an official occupation in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The most recent petition for that failed, so that is still pending, according to NAPO's current leadership. So today, that was exciting. Today, NAPO's membership continued to grow. It more than doubled every year from 1985 to 1990. Today, NAPO, which has been renamed again to the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals, NAPO has more than 3,500 members across more than a dozen countries. And you all know what organizing is. The industry has spawned countless books, blogs, podcasts, and TV shows. There's not a major city in the United States that doesn't have a professional organizer. If you think you don't know a single person who has hired an organizer, you're probably wrong. And that's due in great part to this tiny group of women who built a profession against pretty daunting odds. Together, they created an alternative career path, overcoming sizable obstacles in the course of establishing a female-led profession that continues to grow today. Now, that said, I don't want to idealize these women or the industry itself. I have critiques, my friends. I have critiques. So, for example, organizers often talk about how hard work and, quote, running your business like a business are all it takes to succeed as an organizer. But if you're a rich white woman living in Manhattan and I'm a working class Latina living in rural Oregon, your organizing business is going to kick my organizing business butt, no matter how skilled an organizer I am, right? A lot of it has to do with resources and with the available networks one has, how big those networks are, and how wealthy those networks are. So the playing field is not equal. And until relatively recently, there was not a lot of conversation around that in NAPO. Now that has really changed. We now have the National Association for Black Professional Organizers. NAPO itself has really started to grapple with issues of equity and access and representation in its field. So these things are changing, but there is still this sort of stickiness around old-fashioned ideas about hard work being the key to success, and also the incorporation, ironic for a female-dominated organization, they've sort of accepted a lot of old-fashioned ideas about what professionalism looks like in ways that actually make it harder for women to be seen as professionals, because those rules, of course, weren't designed for women. They were designed for mostly white middle-class men operating in business spheres. So for more of that kind of insight, the critiquey kind of stuff, you're going to have to read the book. But before I close up and open this up to questions, I do want to add a quick note about the book's subtitle, How the Rise of Professional Organizing Shows Us the Way We Work Isn't Working. The rise of organizing is in part about the women I told you about here, the ones who were drawn to this work and who built the profession into what it is today. But for that to happen, people had to hire them. That's the other half of the argument that I make in this book. The organizing industry has grown so exponentially because the amount of stuff we have to manage, not just physical stuff, but mental stuff, everyday tasks and responsibilities, has grown exponentially. Despite gauzy neoliberal narratives celebrating flexibility and self-reliance, over the last half century, American households have found themselves increasingly exhausted and overwhelmed, beleaguered by competing demands around work, home, and family. Now, in response, many households have sought solutions in the form of paid support, much of it provided by women like professional organizers. On the one hand, this has created an array of new occupations, such as organizing, that have the potential to provide meaningful, lucrative work. On the other hand, this system of hiring women to perform the previously unpaid labor of other women eases some of the pains of contemporary life, but it also distracts attention from the systemic problems around the way Americans are expected to work today, both in paid positions and in their unpaid labor at home. And that's why I find organizing so interesting. It's not a perfect profession, nor can it cure what ails us most. But organizing provides a lens for thinking through some of the biggest questions facing us today around how we live, how we work, what we consume and how much of it, what we value, and what, if anything, we plan to do about it all to make life a little more workable. So thank you again for listening, and I'm really excited to hear your questions, but I also wanted to just share with you, the book comes out at the end of this month, but I was able to get a special code for you guys for 30% off US orders. If you go to www.press.uchicago.edu, and there's my little code, PR boxes, you can enter at checkout for 30% off if you'd like a copy. That's my little thank you for spending election day with me. But I would love to hear questions, comments, any thoughts that you all have about what I've just told you about, or about what you'd like to hear more about.
I could just ask one. I'm a pretty tidy person overall, I think, and don't really have a clutter issue in the real world, but digitally I'm kind of a mess.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you see that field as becoming gendered as well, when it's usually, as far as I can tell now, it's on the actual user themselves. Like, I don't know if there's people that come in and will clean up your old stuff, your old files or whatever. So I don't know if that will become another sort of gendered profession, or do you think it'll be a different path, or will it be just everybody out on their own? How do you think that shakes out?
Wendelin, it is? Was that, oh, that's somebody else's ring. Okay,
Oh, that was me.
sorry. Who was it who just asked the question?
Mike.
Mike, hi, Mike. Oh, sorry. I can't see anyone. So first of all, yes, there is a huge sector of the organizing industry for digital organizing. Now, there are some organizers who don't want anything to do with that, and there are other that it's exactly what they specialize in. And there's sort of a subset of that that's a photo organizing professionals, and they do digital and physical organizing of photos. But interestingly, the digital organizing is not gendered male, right? I mean, I know that IT and computing science tend to be, but digital organizing tends to be folded within the other work that most female organizers are doing. The one area that I see that is very gendered within the organizing field is that the most of the men who work in organizing do garage organizing, which is not a shock. It's like most of the men who cooked grill, right? They do garage organizing, so it's like it's in the domestic sphere, but barely, right? It's outside in the manly world beyond the home. They do garage organizing or they do moves. They handle orchestrating moves and relocation, sort of these larger jobs. So thanks. Now, Wendell.
Thanks so much. What a fascinating topic. And I came to organizing with the show from TLC, Clean Sweep. So it's been interesting to see the sort of rise of the profession. I was wondering if you could comment on the commodification of the profession and how somewhat counterintuitively, take the home edit gals, for example, they would encourage people to pare stuff down or reorganize it a certain way, but then you can go to Target and buy their tools off the shelf to get the home edit version of organization. So is that deliberately marketed towards women?
I mean, yes. So great question. Yes, it is deliberately marketed towards women. But one of the interesting things I found, so when I first started studying organizers, my expectation was that organizers were just the human component of the commodification of simple living, right? You had Real Simple, you had the Container Store, and then you have these organizers. And what really was fascinating to me is that organizers are some of the most vocal critics of consumerism, of overconsumption, of environmental waste, right? So on the one hand, you have organizers selling books and products. You have the home edit people. You have Marie Kondo has her own like line of houseware goods. And people went bananas when that happened. They're like, wait, we're supposed to get rid of everything that doesn't spark joy, but buy the stuff that you're promoting, right? So there is that tension. But in the real world, when you go to organizing jobs, most organizers will tell people, do not buy anything before I get there. Because chances are you already have more than you need to get this job done. And if you do need something, let's wait and see what specific thing you might need. So like occasionally an organizer would send a client to Target to pick up a specific shelf if they were reorganizing a space. But more often than not, organizers were actually telling people, no, don't buy any more stuff. You don't need color-coded bins. You don't need to rainbow order the book spines on your bookshelf, right? So what we see on TV is often not a really good representation of real life organizing. And part of that is because having a beautifully designed interior space and having a well-organized space are not at all the same thing, right? So organizers say that sometimes those before and after pictures, they're like porn for organizing clients, but they're not very realistic. Because sometimes the after picture is not at all sexy, but the person using the system can find everything they need within a minute or two, right? So when I watch a show like The Home Edit and they do Reese Witherspoon's closet and create these really elaborate displays for her, costumes from characters over the years, that's not what the vast majority of organizers are doing. Organizers are occasionally called to come in and make something really pretty and color coordinated, but that's a really small portion of what they do. And some like that kind of job, but most of them say they don't. They like the nitty-gritty emotional side of organizing. And when they're in those spaces, if you think about like the Kondo shows up with all these tiny cardboard boxes because she says, like, you don't need to go to the store to buy a bunch of plastic bins. We'll just use these little cardboard boxes we already have, all of us around in our house, and use those to sort your silverware or to put your tiny little socks in or things like that, right? So I think there is a tension between TV shows and organizing brands needing to sell stuff and actual on the ground organizers really not generally advocating for that kind of thing. So thank you for your question. Irena.
Sorry, it took me a while to figure out that I didn't have my speaker thing down. Okay. I want to go back to the very beginning of your talk where you were, and thank you, by the way, for sharing this. This is really fascinating research. But I want to go back to the beginning where you talked about having this kind of very emotional response to having taken a few mugs out of your cabinet and thinking that you'd really done something, and that connection between, you know, the sparking joy, the as if there's some kind of ethical or moral superiority to organization. And I'm very curious about that and how professional organizers address that question of like somehow if you're decluttered, you're somehow a better human being. And what that means in terms of conceptions of class, society, where people live, and how that factors into the profession, if it does at all. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for asking that. So it's interesting. Actually, the second organizer I ever interviewed described organizing as feminist work. And most organizers don't necessarily use that language, but the point she made in saying that I do see across a lot of different organizers, even who might not call themselves feminists. And the point she made, her name's Regina Lark, and the point she made is that women tend to be raised to believe that they have to constantly be consuming things to fix their imperfections. How they look, how they talk, their hair color, their shoes, their weight, their, you know, their homes, whatever it is, they need to buy stuff to fix their inherently flawed selves and spaces. And organizers' job is to tell them, no, you don't. Like you're fine as you are. And that is not what we see in like the TV shows, but it is what I saw in the real life organizing sessions that I looked at, right? So one of the things organizers do is to tell people, first of all, okay, so your space is cluttered. One, clutter's relative. Everybody has a different clutter threshold. So for me, a lot of clutter creates anxiety for me, right? So I need a lower amount of clutter than a lot of people in order to feel like safe and productive in my space. Other people could have completely crowded spaces and feel perfectly fine, right? So if your space feels fine to you, it really doesn't matter if other people outside would judge it as cluttered or disorganized or messy. As long as people are able to safely live in it, and that's the caveat where people with hoarding disorders, it gets a little more complicated. But as long as people are able to safely live in the space, there's nothing wrong with it if it's working for you, right? But when people call organizers, it's generally because it's not working for them anymore. And so in that case, when an organizer goes in, the first thing they're telling clients is there's nothing wrong with you. Like the fact that your mail is stacked up and you haven't gone through it, it doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you're not great at sorting mail. So why don't we figure out like what's a system we can put in place so that A, you get less mail, B, you know what to do with it when it comes in, or C, you outsource it if you really can't take it, right? They're also telling people to get rid of these really unrealistic expectations they have of what they think their homes are supposed to look like. So this one organizer in LA told me that she often tells clients, yeah, I know the pantry you saw on Pinterest, where everything matched and all the items were decanted and it's so pretty. And she said, the people who have that kind of pantry have full-time staff managing their homes for them, right? Like that's what people have. If that pantry and having your home look like that, if that is the most important thing for you in the world, I can help you do that and I can help you maintain it. Like if it matters enough for you to dedicate all of those hours or resources to it. But chances are it's really not the most important thing for you. So why don't we instead lower our expectations, lower the amount of self-judgment and recrimination going on here, and instead focus on like what really is hurting in your home, like what's bothering you. And let's look at that. And let's figure out how we can move on from here to make it a little less stressful. Right. So I think one of the things that organizers often do is to try to push back against that moral story around clutter. And in that way, I see them as like the most impressive critics of the container industrial complex, as opposed to part and parcel of it. Although, as the last question illustrated, right, it is complicated. There are some blurry boundaries there. Heidi.
Hi, yes, your response actually started to answer my question. I apologize. I'm not sure why my video is not working. But
that's okay. We still love you.
Thank you. So I guess my question kind of builds on the last two. It's regarding the gendered issue of this domain, how do we get away from, and I apologize if this is an unfair question, but from perpetuating the stereotype that it is women's work when it is women who are leading this, and it's women who are buying into it?
I mean, that's a great question. There's a couple things that I think are going on that right now in organizing that are interesting. So like I said, when I first started doing this field work in 2012, Regina Lark, and I usually use pseudonyms for the organizers I study, but like the founders or someone like Regina, if they're publicly saying the things specific things they told me again and again, I'll name them by name because Regina has books about this topic and you could find them. So I'm not using a pseudonym in this case. But Regina is really focused on women's disproportionate responsibility for managing the stuff of the house and the way in which this is really like a feminist and political issue. And so she's like right in the course right now of recording a TED talk that's specifically about this, about trying to get men to see the ways in which household labor is not fairly divided, right? But she was pretty unique in that sort of approach to things. Also, interestingly, she's a history PhD who taught history at UCLA for a while before becoming an organizer. There are a lot of PhD women who are professional organizers now after leaving the academy, which is its own interesting article that needs to be written. But I also recently met an organizer named Amelia Pleasant, and Amelia is certified in what's called the Fair Play method. And it's an actual deck of cards. You can buy them on Amazon. They're on my wish list right now. It breaks down every task that is done in the household, everything from like laundry to dishes to who decorates for Christmas to who handles correspondence with in-laws to who takes out the garbage, like all the stuff. And then there's an extra set if you have kids, because that's a whole nother layer of
You
talk.
have it. Elaine has it. I have to get my hands on this.
Elaine has it, and I'm about to have it. But so you can do this in your own household. Anybody in your household, you can sit with these cards and divide them up and see who does what. Because what Regina said is that she often goes and does these speaking events, and a man will come up to her and say, I'm so glad you said this because, you know, my wife and I, we really split things 50-50. And I know that this framing is heteronormative, but it, you know, it's what comes up the most in these conversations around gendered labor in the home, right? He says, my wife and I split it 50-50. And Regina says, that is awesome. Tonight, here's what I'd love you to do for me. I'd like you to go in one room and write a list of everything you do to keep your household going. And I'd like your spouse to go in the other room and write the same list. And then I would like you to compare lists and come back and email me and tell me, is it really 50-50? Because 9,999 times out of 10,000, your wife is actually doing more than you by far, right? So these cards are sort of a structured way to do that. So Amelia Pleasant and others get certified in the Fair Play method, and then they incorporate that into their organizing sessions. So they sit down with everybody in the household and shake out, okay, who does what? And let's look at, are these piles equitable or are they not, right? So I think that's one way, but you kind of have to have people who are open to that intervention. Another thing organizers say is that organizing should be included as school curriculum, just like we're starting to see a lot more focus on mindfulness and wellness in elementary school classrooms. Organizers say that the kind of executive functioning skills that it takes to be organized should really be taught to boys and girls and non-binary kids. All of the kids should be getting lessons on how to be more organized so that it serves them better later in life. And it's interesting because a lot of those skills are the kinds of things that used to be taught in home economics classes. But because those classes were generally offered only for female students, sometimes required of female students, you know, the feminist movement was really critical of home economics and pushing it out of schools. And now we see an interesting return push for home economics, whatever you want to call it, to be reintegrated into the curriculum because, and I don't have the evidence around this, but organizers and a lot of other people are convinced that we've somehow lost, especially with most households requiring multiple incomes to get by, we've lost the situation where any one person specializes in those kinds of tasks. So people either do without, or if they have the resources, they hire other people to do it for them, but nobody is kind of learning them. So a lot of organizers actually talked about one woman suggested, she was in New York, and she talked about offering a class called Housewifery 101, sort of tongue in cheek, where she would teach you how to clean a house and how to do laundry, right? And that if everyone was learning these things when they were young, that perhaps the gendered connotation that all of a sudden, if you enter into a household where there's a man and a woman, right? The woman has sort of been skilled in this stuff her whole life, informally or formally, and the man is like, well, you should do the ironing because I'm really terrible at it, right? If anybody actually irons anymore, I don't know. I took out an iron to do like a shrinky dink thing, and my son asked me what that was. And I thought, oh, how far we've come. My child doesn't even know what an iron looks like. I'm doing my small part to decrease household labor.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for a fascinating talk, Dr. Lane, and thanks to all for attending this noontime talk. I believe this is our last one of this semester, so keep your eye out for information on next semester's series.
Thank
See
you
all
so
again
much,
soon.
Mike, and thank you all for having me and for sharing your day with me. And I'm just going to leave this little code up here in case anybody didn't catch it last time.
Thank you so much. Take care.